Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the third retro seminar of this term. My name is Rita Mota, and I'm the Intesa Sanpaolo Research Fellow at the Oxford University Center for Corporate Reputation. With me today is Alan Morrison, Professor of Law and Finance here at the Said Business School in Oxford, who co-convenes Retro with me, and our guest speaker, Kirsten Martin. Kirsten is William P. and Hazel B. White Center Professor of Technology Ethics in the Mendoza College of Business at the University of Notre Dame. She's an expert on the ethics of technology, privacy, and AI accountability, and her research addresses questions such as employee monitoring, online privacy and trust, and the separation of technology and ethics. Kirsten is a prolific researcher, and she has published extensively in top academic journals. She is also a brilliant public speaker. By the way, you should all check out her TED Talk about online privacy. And she's deeply involved in the international business ethics community. For example, she's an editor for the Journal of Business Ethics, and she's the president of the board of directors of the Society for Business Ethics. It is an absolute pleasure to have Kirsten with us today, and I'll turn the floor over to her in a minute. But before I do so, let me say a few quick words about the seminar. Retro stands for Reputation, Ethics, Trust, and Relationships at Oxford. As many, or indeed most of you already know, Retro is concerned with the ethical and normative content of trust and reputation in organizational life. The seminar series is generously supported by the Center for Corporate Reputation, which is an interdisciplinary research center directed by Rupert Younger here at the Said Business School. Even though it started as an in-person event that moved online due to the pandemic, we have decided to keep Retro virtual because there is so much to gain from having these conversations with you, people from all over the world. So thank you for coming and for bringing new perspectives to these seminars. And I would also like to thank the people who make Retro possible. Rupert Younger, director of the CCR, who's always so incredibly supportive. Chris Page, Marquise Morgan, and Darius Jawa, who do all of the crucial backstage work to make these seminars happen. And of course, Alan, whose wisdom and experience have been essential to the existence and success of the series. Today's seminar addresses a very important and timely question about business responsibility for algorithmic bias. The entire world is becoming more and more dependent on technology, and algorithms decide and define increasingly large parts of our lives. But the same technology that facilitates our interactions and improves our quality of life may be profoundly harmful at an individual and societal level. Recent calls for accountability for those harms have been met with a number of excuses that often boil down to the impossibility of understanding exactly how AI works, or with arguments about the supposed neutrality of algorithms. Kirsten is going to discuss arguments of this type. She is going to explain what they mean for corporate accountability, and she will show us how to examine the morality of AI. I think I can speak for everyone in the room today when I say that we're all very much looking forward to learning from Kirsten on this topic. Kirsten will speak for around 20 to 30 minutes, during which time she will respond to clarification questions only. After that, we will have some time for questions and answers. You already know how this works. Please enter your questions and comments into the Q&A box, not the chat, and either Alan or I will relay them to Kirsten. You can find the Q&A button either at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on the device that you are using. We're going to finish promptly at 5 p.m. as always. Kirsten, thank you so much for being here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you inviting me here and giving me the opportunity to talk about this subject matter. I'm excited to actually get feedback from everyone, as well as this is kind of a continuing project talking about biases and AI and corporate responsibility. Let me make sure. There we go. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about algorithmic bias, which we've all heard that phrase before, and corporate responsibility. So even within AI ethics and within discussions around bias, discrimination, fairness, and the ethics of AI, my work always pulls me back to what's the responsibility of corporations, or what's the responsibility of firms in either developing, deploying, or using that AI program. And so I'm going to focus on two mistaken arguments that I think we're allowing corporations to make, and we can think through how we might be repeating them in our own scholarship. And I'm going to make a claim that we need to stop doing that ourselves, but also to not take that as an answer from corporations. And so when we look at, these are just a few headlines of the predictive and categorization analytics that we have around face scanning, around jobs, around a sheriff office using them in the United States to predict criminality of students, the formulas that came out around Facebook's recommendation algorithm, someone being wrongfully accused of a crime, fired by a bot by Amazon, and drug addiction risk algorithms. And also we have Instagram and teens and the recommendations that they see. So we see these issues all around us all the time. And these are just in the last year of the issues that we see with Facebook, Instagram, different face scanning algorithms and facial recognition being used. And so in this presentation, I'm going to argue two things. One is that arguing that judging AI on efficiency and pretending that algorithms are inscrutable produces this veil of the technological imperative that shields corporations from being held accountable for their value-laden decisions. So this kind of puts a veil up that we can't question them any longer. But I'm arguing that they actually are making value-laden decisions that we need to hold them responsible around design, development, and then deployment of algorithms. That corporations are going to be responsible for both the value-laden decisions, but also importantly around interrogating the AI that they design and develop. And I'll get into how we would interrogate AI or question AI towards the end of my presentation. So first, I'm going to show you the kind of typical deterministic arguments that people make, just as kind of throwaway lines that we hear a lot around and that lead corporations to not being held responsible. And then actually how we are reinforcing this idea of the technological imperative around the best AI or the best technology is that a technology that's created, the market decides, and technology is really very neutral. It's the most efficient thing out there, and we really shouldn't be questioning it or can question it. And then focus on the value-laden construction of AI and how we might interrogate AI. So what are these determinism arguments that we hear a lot? So these are the two typical ones that you hear, and they're how a lot of AI ethicists or people that look at materiality of technology focus themselves within either pushing away from social determinism, which is technology is this blank slate, neutral and socially constructed, or pushing against the idea of a deterministic argument around technology, where it's determining society, it's value-laden, and it's kind of outside of society's control, almost this internal dynamic that's creating it. And so these are the two extremes that we hear. Sometimes we'll see society is to blame, they blame bad data. So you hear this from computer scientists a lot, or bad uses. So it's not really the computer scientist or the engineer or the technologist or the data scientist that's actually doing the bad. If we just got better data, which was created by those dirty humans that create bad data, or it's just based on the data in use, and it's really just the bad data and the society that's causing these problems. Key to both of those, this idea that society is to blame, is that the developing firm is not responsible then for any discrimination, fairness issues, bias in the algorithm in use. On the other side of things, we have technological determinism, which is actually that nobody is to blame, that technology is somewhat autonomous, that developing firms are not responsible in this case either. And so when we look at this, what I say is that there's actually two things going on here. First, we have technology as being either neutral or value-laden. That's on the top axis. So before we conflated these ideas. And then you can ask who's in control. So those are two separate ideas, because what most of us argue within AI ethics or STS is that technology can be both value-laden with moral importance, but also society is in control of that value-ladenness. And so unfortunately, we kind of focus on technology being value-laden as meaning that technology is in control. That's this idea of technological determinism. We also have this idea of it being neutral where society is in control. But most, I would say most people active in this space are in this value-laden biases area, where you have biased AI with value-laden decisions in design, development, and deployment that have moral implications. But society all the way is influencing that in the development, in the deployment, and in the use, choosing the data, which factors, how do you describe the outcome variable, that this is constructed, this value-ladenness, and in design and then in use. Unfortunately, we tend to go towards a technological imperative, which is that this efficient AI that really can't be questioned is something that's outside of our control and is neutral. And so this is the part that's actually kind of dangerous. And so what do I mean by value-ladenness? So I just want to, this is just kind of a typical, really simplistic diagram of how an algorithm would be created from training data. And that if we think of training data as just the available data that's possibly important to the decision as told by those who recorded the factors, we would see bias and fairness, privacy issues, norms and power, and the ethics of care, critical race issues within the data, training data itself. when we look at the algorithm, it's really the rules and policy norms and laws that are being encoded into what's the relative importance of the factors that we're going to use. When we look at the source and the live data that we use it with, that we have the same issues with the training data around bias, fairness, privacy, norms, power, critical theories, and the ethics of care. And then with the outcome, we have issues around accuracy, bias, disparate impact, fairness, harms, rights being violated, norms, the laws, the ethics of care, power. These are all the issues that we have with the outcome. So this is how we have value ladenness throughout the entire process. So this would actually suggest that we should be down in this lower right-hand corner with the value-laden biases, but I'm going to argue that we're making the mistake of allowing companies to frame this as the technological imperative. And I'm going to show you kind of what I mean by that while we're in the upper left-hand corner, when most people are going to, and I'm not unique in this, even Langdon Winner, that's been cited in the US frequently, which is great, would argue in the lower right-hand corner where society is actually controlling something that has politics or bias. So how do we have the technological imperative? So let me make sure I'm here. So constructing the technological imperative. Sorry, my keyboard was sticking. So first we have this idea of inscrutable AI with unfortunate outcomes. So the AI may have some, like we see the AI come out and we have a hiring algorithm by Amazon and it's discriminating like crazy and women aren't being hired or people that come from women's colleges aren't being hired. And we look at it and we think it's really unfortunate. It has a lot of bias and disparate impact and there are fairness issues. But then the argument is that, it's not working, there we go, that you hear this, that the whole entire program is then inscrutable. So you hear this term inscrutable, or we can't really explain it, or when people ask for transparency, it's really so confusing that even you'll hear the computer scientists really don't know what's going on. And there's a great piece by Joshua Kroll, who's a computer science professor, called kind of like the idea of inscrutability is a fallacy. And the idea is that while we don't know everything that's going on with all business decisions, but even with AI, they do know a lot. And that the decision to not explain something or to not know what's going on is actually a decision that corporations make when they have the power to not answer those decisions. And so we first have this problem with inscrutability, where people declare that the first part of the training data, the development of the algorithm and how it works with the source data is something that really can't be explained, even though we have these unfortunate outcomes. The second thing that we do is that we have this idea of AI being efficient with accurate outcomes, because we just assume that's the most efficient and the most accurate thing. But we can explain it, but we just assume, and we can look at this and say, well, that's unfortunate data. We might see this we use AI in the US for sentencing or parole decisions. And we might say, well, that's really unfortunate. There's a lot of bias in the data because the data was gathered over the last decades when there was a lot of discrimination within the US justice system. But because it's AI, it must be efficient or accurate. And so you hear this a lot of times when I'm giving a talk, it's usually an economist that will say something like, oh, well, but we know that the AI is the most efficient way to do things, or we know that the AI is the most accurate way, or is more accurate than humans. And so as if and there's a couple things wrong with this. One is that efficient and accurate for whom, right? So we have issues around efficiency and accuracy might be efficient and accurate for some groups of people, but not for other groups of people. And efficiency is not normally our only goal in organizations. So when we think of manufacturing, or if we think of financing, or if we think of decisions around HR, we don't always look for the most efficient or accurate decision. We usually look for the best business decision that may not be the most efficient decision. So an efficient answer might be to make cars really, really fast with lots of problems that they have to deal with down the line. But we in the United States, finally in the 90s, figured out we shouldn't really do that. And we decided efficient actually wasn't the most important thing. We should actually just make quality cars. And so the idea of efficiency is not always a business goal, even though it may be a goal within computer science or data science. It's not normally the goal that we only have within business. And then I'll just point to a great philosopher, Gabrielle Johnson, who I really like her writing. And it's around, she writes around, is algorithms, are they value free? And she makes a great point that efficiency and accuracy are values. And this is a little bit tied to number 2, in that you can have other ways of valuing an AI program. But she really pushes hard on the idea that claiming that efficiency and accuracy are neutral is a mistake, and that these are value-laden decisions to actually have those as values of what's important to look for in an AI or an algorithm. So what do we end up having? When we have this argument of inscrutable AI, with the idea of these efficient outcomes, there's really no role then for corporate responsibility around design, development, deployment, or use of AI systems. I don't know what's going on, but even if I did know what's going on, it's the most efficient and accurate outcome, which means that the market will pick the best one. Since the market is efficient and we know that this AI is more efficient than the human, then we all of a sudden will kind of pick the AI without being able to understand what's going on. There's really no decision making or no responsibility within each of these steps. And this is how we get back to this idea, and these are just from a couple of weeks ago. You see this, the challenges of explaining the black box AI systems, and this is always positioned as in, do you want to have an AI system or do you want it to be explainable, as if you have to make an either or choice. Like there's not an idea that you could actually interrogate a current AI system. They're transforming background checks, quicker and more accurate, the problem of explainability, how can we make it more efficient, the practical benefits for accurate forecasting. So we see this kind of mantra around efficiency and accuracy, and also inscrutability kind of on a constant basis within the popular press. But if you read some, and I find this a little bit unfortunate, if you see some work within management or business schools more recently, you see it kind of creeping into the hyper rationality and efficiency and accuracy of AI, or kind of the idea that it's neutral or better than anything else. There was one recently around using it for HR, and there was no discussion around marginalization or gamification or autonomy of workers, or it was just the idea that, oh, this could actually make the US companies more efficient in the implementation of AI without any kind of critical thinking about it. So this issue follows us. So what we're missing when we black box over these, and black box is not, is from Frank Pascal, but the idea that we actually are laying over top and hiding really what's going on around either the efficiency answer of the outcome, or we're pretending that it's inscrutable as to what's the training data, what was the actual source or live data, what are the important factors in the algorithm, how can we contest these decisions, we're hiding that when we claim that it's inscrutable. Okay. So what are the implications for corporate responsibility given with interrogating AI? So what we've covered so far. So first, I kind of talked briefly about this idea of social and technological determinism, but then showed that really what most people, at least within this area of AI ethics, would really focus on that lower right quadrant, which is which is the idea of value-laden biases that are constructed in design, development, use, and even deployment. But we are making the mistake of falling into the corporate narrative of technological imperative, which is that the sufficient AI that really cannot be questioned. And this is what I'm saying is a mistake. And so this is this idea of both inscrutable, but also efficient and accurate outcomes. And so what I'm going to argue now is kind of just to give an example of how, without knowing much about a program, how we really can be querying and asking questions around AI. Okay, so how do we interrogate outcomes? So outcomes, we would ask, what is the phenomenon that we're trying to represent with this outcome? How was this outcome among all the outcomes chosen? We saw this more recently with the Facebook files when they were published by Wall Street Journal. We knew a lot. I mean, it was widely actually reported that they had a recommendation algorithm that was promoting what they even saw as harmful material, lawful but awful, as my friend Elizabeth Reneros calls it, material, because it was actually, they found increasing engagement, which helps them with ad dollars. So we knew this. What the Facebook files actually showed, what they were really fine-tuning the outcome variable of deciding that like a certain number of likes versus a thumbs down versus a negative emoji were worth certain points. It was very handcrafted. I mean, it was kind of 5 points for one thing, 7 points for another. And so it wasn't as, autonomously developed as one might think. It was a lot of fine tuning that goes on to decide that. And so it's a fair question to always ask, what was the outcome variable? Why did you choose this outcome variable and not others? For whom does this outcome variable represent the phenomenon of interest? So GPA is very good at predicting success for some people in college, but not for others. So for whom is this actually a really accurate representation? For whom is value created and who is disempowered by choosing this outcome versus another? So these are all ethical questions that we would ask of any decision that you were being made, whether it was automated or augmented by AI or just done by a human. And we can ask these questions about the outcomes of AI. And so we have tools within business ethics and management to actually query these types of things. When we look at the data, what data factors I would always want to know did you not include? So which ones would be of privacy violations, unfair or inappropriate for this decision? So an example, it's not always a privacy issue. So sometimes you legitimately have access to some data. Let's just say I'll use the GPA again. But we might decide it's really inappropriate to use GPA as a factor as to what type of healthcare you get. Because they're just in different areas of your life. Michael Walzer calls them the spheres of justice, that we don't like it when winners in one sphere of life, academia, win in another totally unrelated sphere of life, like healthcare. And so it might be just inappropriate to use GPA to predict healthcare outcomes because we've just decided as a society that that's not appropriate to use. Or what factors did you not include because doing so resulted in outcomes that were a privacy violation, unfair, or inappropriate? So not just the using of it, but just the outcome ended up being inappropriate. When we look at the algorithm, what assumptions were made about how the data is distributed? What does that assumption mean for different types of people? What assumptions were made about missing data? So this is interesting. There was a great article in the MIT Technology Review about mortgages, and they found that, which is not surprising, that mortgages were being offered in better terms for some people versus others. But the primary driver of it for this article was missing data. And so it wasn't that people had bad data. It's just that some people weren't well represented in the data sets that they were using to predict trustworthiness and actually paying back loans. And so they were getting worse terms. And so it didn't have anything to do with bad data. It actually just had to do with missing data and the assumptions that the computer scientists made about that missing data. So we should be asked, should people be punished for not being well represented in that particular data set? And the key is to actually take the words and actually make them more individualized to a person. So when computer scientists talk about data and missing data, we would just ask questions about, should people be punished for not being well represented in the data set? And that's a very different humanistic way of talking about the people in the data set. Also on algorithms in the development, how are outliers treated? For some people may not know this, but computer scientists actually have to make an assumption or penalize the model for how when they're optimizing, how much to penalize an outlier. So is it really bad to be an outlier, or really, really bad to be an outlier, or just kind of bad to be an outlier? And you can imagine if you just say, well, it's bad, but it's not that bad to be an outlier, you're going to allow more outliers to exist in your final in your final model. And so the idea would be like, how did you view outliers? Is it really a bad thing to be an outlier? Did you attempt to bring everyone more into the fold, or did you allow a lot of people to be outliers if they didn't perfectly fit the model? How did you test it? We've all heard about overfitting and those types of things. And then finally, how was this algorithm designed to identify, judge mistakes in use or fix the mistakes in use? A lot of people see mistakes that come out and they should be, one idea is that all AI that's developed should be seen as beta tested, and that you are constantly looking for mistakes and seeing how it's going, kind of biased in one way or discriminating in one way versus another. And then you have some sort of ability to actually judge whether that's a mistake that's kind of trending in the wrong direction and have the ability to fix the mistake. And I remember a number of years ago, I was at a conference, but this is a long time ago, at IBM Research was giving a presentation, and they had this great dashboard for claims adjudication for insurance. And the idea was that you could see in real time how thousands of claims were being decided by the AI program, and you could see if it was getting off track, if certain groups were being discriminated against, and you could look in and see, well, is that appropriate? Is there some sort of anomaly in the data that's actually making it go off track? And the idea would be that you could correct it. So it's a fair question of like, how are we going to catch mistakes? How are we going to fix and judge mistakes? And then also, for whom is the AI program accurate and for whom is it not accurate? I mean, the whole idea around AI programming or automating is that it's good for the majority of the people. And so a lot of times, I was talking to a friend, April Williams is at Michigan. She's here as a fellow and does work on race and technology. And she says that the computer scientists will call them edge cases, which I think is a great, and usually we call them outliers. But there's people who are outliers, and they might be groups of people. And what assumptions are they making about those people for whom it's not accurate? A lot of times they assume that they're random and that there's no commonality around the outliers. And that's just assumption that they make. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. We can ask, is there some commonality? Are they all women? Or do they all only have a high school degree? Are they all were they all sick at one point? Did they all have COVID? I mean, there are other questions that we can ask to see if there's any correlation among the outliers. Okay, so this is kind of how we can think about interrogating. This is not exhaustive. This is only to say, even based on you don't need to know much about it, but only even just questioning it like a business decision, what are the questions that we could ask about AI? Okay, so in a nutshell, what I've argued is that claiming that algorithms are neutral or that the design decisions of computer scientists are neutral obscures these morally important decisions of computer and data scientists. And so these aren't neutral decisions, these are value-laden decisions. And that specifically that judging AI on efficiency and pretending that AI is inscrutable produces this veil of the technological imperative, which shields corporations from being held accountable for the value-laden decisions that are made in design and deployment of algorithms. And I hope that I've kind of explained the dangers of kind of falling into this idea of efficiency and inscrutability, because it really is a way for corporations to hide behind this veil. And we really should be helping to dismantle the veil. And we really should not be doing anything that reinforces the veil of claims of efficiency and inscrutability. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. That was absolutely fantastic. My head's spinning with so much.
I know, I'm sorry. I talk too fast. I'm sorry.
No. It was wonderful. It's just a lot of things to think about. So I just like to remind people in the audience, first of all, that you should use the Q&A function to ask your questions and enter your comments. Alan and I will monitor that, and we'll relay your questions and comments to Kirsten. And we already have some questions coming up, but I'd just like to start with a bit of a clarification question. Mm-hmm. So you suggested all of these really interesting questions that we can ask to interrogate AI and to try to understand exactly what's going on, and where the mistakes are being made and how and by whom. I guess I have two questions about those questions. So the first one is, who should be asking these questions? And the second one is, who should we be asking these questions to? So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think so. Like, even just as I think we should be asking those questions, like executives or managers within the company that are developing the AI system, especially if it's being used within its own company, would need to be asking those questions around signing off on saying that something is actually, should go live. There's an article called Model Cards for Algorithms, or Model Cards for, I'll find it and I can post it, which is it's a set of questions that they suggest should be asked about any algorithm before you kind of let it loose and say that it's done. It's almost a tag that you'd put on it, like a data sheet that you used to have around materials. And you'd put it on there and say, this is kind of the specifications of this model. And so it's not really just being efficient. You would ask those questions of the computer scientist before signing off. But more importantly, I think the companies, we tend to focus on the development companies, but I actually think that companies that develop AI, if they're standalone companies that develop AI systems, so they have mainly data scientists and computer scientists, they will find a solution for whatever the users ask for. So if the companies that like adopt the AI system, either from a different group internally or purchase it, like the judicial system purchases Compass or purchases another AI program or facial recognition program, they should be asking those questions before purchasing it. So they should be asking and saying, I'm responsible for this business decision. I need to know if it's biased or if it's going to make mistakes, because I'm legally responsible for hiring. So if I hire, whether I augment it with AI or not, I'm Amazon and I'm responsible for those hiring decisions. And so I need to, as a user, the client that's adopting the AI program, need to be asking those questions of anything that you purchase. I think the problem is that we're not pushing back enough. And there should be, and this is where I think within business schools, we are well versed in this, of saying, well, when else do we purchase supplies and not ask these types of questions? So you would always ask those questions if you're getting new raw material, or getting anything that those coming in as supply to your operations. You would ask those types of questions as to the quality. How is it made? How can you guarantee that it works correctly? What's the terms of when something goes wrong? Who's at fault? Those are all kind of open questions that you would ask. And even if you were hiring, getting a robot, you would ask those questions for a manufacturing line. And we need to be thinking the same way around AI programs, is to push back and say, these are the type of questions that businesses need to ask before adopting AI. And then that'll initiate that conversation within the engineers and the computer scientists.
So you've essentially already answered one of the questions from Alessandro Tirapani, who is wondering about what corporation meant and how we treat the companies that develop these algorithms versus the companies that just use them when they were developed by someone else. And I guess I'd just like to add something on top of that and ask you, should we hold these two different types of companies to account differently when we see them using algorithms that are biased?
So I think at this point, I would actually put the focus on the adopting or the using company, because they own the business decision, whether it's a human doing it 100%. So going through the resumes one by one, all by themselves, doing hand interviews one by one and making a decision. The company is actually responsible for that decision and whether they're discriminatory or not, right? Like, so legally in the United States, you could be held, civilly get in trouble if you were to discriminate on a regular basis, or even just once. I mean, it doesn't really need a lot. But no matter what type of augmentation that we use, if we use a spreadsheet, we start using facial recognition, we use a program to actually read through resumes, it's still the business decision of the firm that purchased or adopted the AI program to actually be responsible and make the decisions as to, well, what do I need to know about this program before I use it so that I'm making good business decisions that are legal and ethical. I mean, that should be the standard. And I think we kind of make a mistake when we think that it changes fundamentally the decision when we augment it with AI. And that's why I don't like the term automate, but I like augment better, because it means that there's still humans in charge of the decision and they're just deciding how much to augment their decision using a technology. And so I actually put more focus, I would put more focus on the adopting company because they know their business needs more, and then they need to put those demands on whoever is developing the AI. Does that help answer?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Alan?
Thanks, Rita. We have a lot of really good questions coming up in the Q&A. I was about to say I'll take advantage of the fact that I'm speaking first to make up my own, but it sort of overlaps a little bit with the question that Philippe Mochette has just typed into the Q&A. I was thinking about the nature of the interrogation as you spoke, that the organization should make of the AI. And I was thinking a little bit as you've done that, this is a business decision that the organization uses, that the organization owns. So it's the adopting organization that presumably matters. And I wondered if one could use work that Daniel Dennett, the philosopher, has promulgated in the past, what he calls the intentional stance.
Mm-hmm.
He says when you're dealing with a complex system, if the complex system makes any sense at all, you can treat it as if it has the sort of intentional states that human beings have. So I believe certain things, I don't believe other things, I have certain goals and certain desires, and I deny other goals and desires. And those are things that you can reasonably ask about when you hire me. So if you asked me a question that revealed I was prejudiced against some group of people, you wouldn't hire me to look at CVs.
Right.
Maybe rather than looking at the inputs, we should look at the outputs. So pretend that the AI has intentional states like you and I do, and just try and ask it questions. So you could characterize the AI as a racist, even though it isn't, because it isn't the person. But if it makes sense, presumably it's got some consistent motivating attitudes. So you treat it like it's a person. So I wonder if maybe interrogation could rather than saying complicated things that I don't really understand about how the data is designed and the algorithm designed, just ask it the questions in a clever way that you might ask a person to try and reveal prejudices. And if they exist, then the AI is inappropriate. So could we think of it as an intentional, what Dennett calls an intentional system?
I like that. I like his work on also it was a short article that was like, I could have done otherwise, so what, like around determinism and autonomy. And I think, so there's someone in actually Deb Johnson, who's at UVA, has a paper on, this gets to the idea of why people don't like technological determinism and saying that AI does things. So the issue for a lot of people is that then it's a moral entity or a moral actor. And so the question is, does it have intentionality? And then all of a sudden you're in this idea of technological determinism. So they think by saying that it's discriminatory, or if you put it as the protagonist of the story, right? Like you're putting in the front of the sentence versus the end of the sentence in English, that all of a sudden it has some sort of intentionality. And Dennett would be fine with that and just say, let's an intentional state. And Deb Johnson does this kind of a dance around moral entities that do moral acts, but not a moral agent. She just doesn't want to use the term agent, which I'm fine with that. I mean, like, so she has the same kind of issue around it. And I think that if we do think of things as having intentional stances or intentional states or intentional, this idea of being a moral entity, even if we don't go to moral actor, is that it actually could be discriminatory, and we can ask it questions as if it was discriminatory. We shouldn't be, I think the reason why people are afraid, and I say people, I think mainly scholars, is that they feel like it's a slippery slope into declaring it to be autonomous. And does that make, so they don't want to say that it has any type of state whatsoever because they're afraid of going into deterministic arguments. But there's a lot of writing that do what you did and what Dennett does, is having this middle ground of saying like, oh, no, I can actually say that the AI program is being discriminatory without it saying that it's out of my control. I don't need to say that it's a moral agent that we should sue. We can still say that we sue the company. You know what I mean? Like, so we do this on a regular basis.
I take the intentional stance. If you hire a
exactly
redneck racist, I can still hide. I can fight. I can sue you, right?
Right. And then it actually gets to the point when I first heard this is like 4 or 5 years ago, and it was actually at a law scholars conference, a privacy law scholars conference, and someone said, you know, they're not explainable. And I flippantly said, I can't wait for the first deposition. And I was like, and they kind of were like, what do you mean? And to your point, like when you, there's a lot of times people don't know why that they were racist. And when you say, why did you not hire that person? They just say, I don't know. I just didn't like them. And so humans are almost as inscrutable as AI. And yet we still hold the business to account when they hire people that are discriminatory, you know, and whether or not they're augmented by technology, we should do that as well.
Presumably, if we're holding a business to account, we think the business has some intentional states.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's another thing in business ethics.
Say the AI has intentional states.
Right.
Geeta.
Yeah, let's get into moral agency here. Otherwise, we'll stay here for a couple more hours.
Right.
There's an interesting question here from JC Rees Antes about value trade-offs, essentially. So efficiency is obviously not the only goal in organizations, but there might be instances in which it's necessary to trade off certain values and to think about hierarchies between them and all of that. And the question here says that there's been almost absolute consensus in machine learning that there are inevitable trade-offs, even with values like fairness that may have different aspects to it. And so the question is whether you think that there aren't such trade-offs, or if you think that we just need to be very careful and pay attention to each different value that's at stake. And I would add another question on top of that. If companies and people within companies actually are deciding how to trade off between important values, are they the right entities to be doing that?
So I agree with you. I actually agree with you, but the idea that I think there will be trade-offs always, but there is in manufacturing or HR hiring of going faster versus a quality car and hiring the right person. And so we find these kind of balancing of environmental concerns versus making the car that goes the fastest, right? And environmental concerns is a great example of something that used to in the United States not be very important at all. In fact, it was an annoyance, right? And they had to be criminally prosecuted to actually comply with our laws. I mean, so we have a great history of ignoring that as a value. And now it's elevated to the point where there are certain products that just wouldn't make if there was too much environmental damage, both because the employees would be upset about it, but also the consumers and the stockholders would be upset if it had too much environmental damage. So that's a good example of a trade-off that we had for years. And the value of the one value, that like our importance on the one value kind of grew to the point where it was a non-negotiable. At a certain point, it was non-negotiable issue. So I think that there are times, though, in certain circumstances where, for example, fairness or contestability, which I like better than transparency, is a value that's just non-negotiable. So if there are certain decisions around hiring and you're like, well, I can do it a lot faster, but I don't know why or who I'm hiring, I think a business should say that's not acceptable. We have to know why we're hiring different people and exactly why people were denied, because honestly, the law would say that I have to explain it at some point. And so there might be other ones such as, I don't know, the default color screen that you see when you go on your social network site, or the color of the advertising that you see, or the type of, I mean, there are other types of decisions that could be made and automated with AI or augmented with AI that we don't need to have contestability. And if we don't quite understand why blue versus green, we're okay with that. You know, so there's other kind of more innocuous, I think Cathy O'Neil calls them pivotal versus non-pivotal decisions that we a lot of times these pivotal decisions, like do you get a mortgage, do you get a house, do you get into university? Like these are critical decisions in someone's life. And a lot of times we have a lot of scrutiny around them. And so those, we might not trade off efficiency for contestability or understanding why something happened, or fairness might be something that we decide it's non-negotiable. But I think the trade-off thing, I agree with the trade-off thing. It's just that those are always trade-offs. And so they're always trade-offs. So I think right now the issue that we have is that sometimes in engineering or computer science, they just assume there is that you have to make it more efficient and that fairness is just a bump on the road. But second, we should actually say, look, how can we find some more optimal solutions? And engineers are great at that. If you tell them that there's a new problem that you have that is not only about efficiency, they're like, oh, I just have to find a new optimal. I can try to figure that out. But the key is that there's another issue about funding engineers, but that's another story about how they're funded.
I guess I'm just thinking about situations where there might be some implications that would render the decision maker a bit like a political actor. So, for example, if you have an algorithm that is extremely good at tackling some sort of social problem, but has some unintended consequence, and perhaps the people who are developing this algorithm think it's not a big deal, it only affects a very, very insignificant proportion of the population, and the benefits are so good, we're deciding to do this, but actually, do they have the legitimacy to make such a decision? And is it even possible for developers to think in these terms?
Oh, so Facebook's a great example of that. We were chit-chatting about this before we came on, but that's a great example because the developers actually did. So this is the recommendation algorithm and recommending kind of when they were tweaking what was recommended last year around. And so this is not content takedown. This is just recommending into your newsfeed or posts groups that you might join. And they found that they were really recommending a lot of what Elizabeth Reneros calls lawful but awful material. And so this is stuff that they can leave up that's not illegal or against their policies, but really is considered really not, even by their users, not good for the world. But it turns out people stare at it or it gets more engagement from some Facebook users. And the engineers came up with solutions and were like, look, we have a little bit less engagement, but we can really improve the type of content that we're promoting. And for the longest time, the policy folks came over and said, no, we don't want to do that. We want to have more engagement, even if it's really awful material. And then leading up to the election, they kind of started having better material, and then they released it after the election in the United States, and they allowed lawful but awful material to grow. We had huge problems around misinformation around vaccines and the pandemic. We also had the issue around recommending the insurrection that they had around the January 6th attack on the Capitol here in the United States, which they promoted, which the recommendation algorithm promoted in Facebook. But that's a good example that the engineers actually were more on top of it than the law and policy people. They had come up with solutions. They saw it. They were upset about it. They tried to raise the alarm internally. And the law and policy folks kind of overrode it and say, no, we need to go with engagement instead. And I think, I think for Zuckerberg, he argues that it should just be a law, that it's not up to them to make these types of decisions, which is not uncommon for companies to say. Back in the 70s and 80s with car companies and safety in the United States, they said the same thing. They said, safety is not our job. We're not the right ones to choose safety. We can't innovate around safety and do the best thing for users. So, you shouldn't look to us to safety. We just make cars. That's the only answer. And that's just not how it worked out. So they actually were really good at innovating around safety, that now, selling things on safety is actually something that you do. And so I think the companies are they're almost have to, because they're the most intimately involved with what the algorithm is recommending or whether or not they're actually harming certain types of people. And any type of broad brush law is not going to get to the intricacies of what they're seeing on the ground, if that makes sense. There are laws that could help. For example, if there was whistleblower protections for people that raise the alarm, that would go a really long way. But that's to protect the people that are really closest to the action. And, if you're the equivalent of the person on the manufacturing line, you see what's wrong and you should be able to blow the whistle and say, look, there's something really wrong and we're harming some people and we need to actually raise this up. But right now there's no protections for them in tech companies. And so that's the one law that I could see being helpful.
Thank you. Alan?
I've got a slightly involved question, but I'm going to use it to knock off about 5 things on the Q&A list. So several people are asking questions that I view as related, although they may not when I read them out. And I'm interested in the institutional foundations of some of what you're talking about. So, so the sort of thing that I'm worrying about is something that's addressed in a question by Bilgehan Zunker, for example, who asks, first of all, whether anyone really believes that these decisions are neutral. And secondly, relatedly, why do companies hide behind the technological imperative? And I had a related question. You said during your talk that this is a corporate narrative. The technological imperative is a corporate narrative. And it's not a priori obvious to me that corporations have to adopt a particular narrative. And I presume they do so because we live in a rational technical order, and what makes you legitimate is your ability to fit in with the institutional structure that supports a rational technological order. One of our anonymous attendees has said, firms are in the business of making profits. Their business imperative is to make a profit and to sell. That feels like a statement of a rational technological order. Another anonymous attendee says that he or she comes from a business school where the overarching narrative is that everything digital is good because it's innovative and entrepreneurial.
That's right.
Which again, it feels like maybe what's at work here is a rational technological order that's just coming slightly unraveled in the face of new technology. And relatedly, therefore, one might ask what the right thing to do about this is. If the rational technological order leading to outcomes that we find intuitively wrong, but cognitively everyone thinks that they're inevitable, is the answer to talk to companies, or does this require regulation? So Oliver Butler says, do we need external regulations? The only way to reset the cognitive frames that we have actually to impose some change.
Yeah. So I think let me go to the beginning, which is, do they really say this? Is that one of the questions was like, is it really the argument of corporations that what they're doing is it's just the most efficient and accurate is going to be AI, and that's the benefit. And then there's a trade-off to if you actually want something that creates value or is fair or non-discriminatory. And then the second one is the idea of inscrutability, that we just can't explain it. It's, I would say at least the narrative that comes out in even the headlines that I showed is around we can't explain AI. And so the idea is that, and I wouldn't say that computer scientists think this. So if you talk to computer scientists, they're actually quite verbose about like the calls that they have to make. And even the Facebook example is a great one, that the computer scientists are really well aware of the value-laden decisions that they're making. And they are really trying to do better by it. So if you ask them, like, are you just a dummy that pushes a button and you don't know anything at all what's going on? A good computer scientist would say, no, I mean, I know what theory I'm using and I know what assumptions I'm making about the data. And I can answer a lot of those questions that you just asked. And so I don't think that the computer scientist, the question is always, does the company itself want to query it and ask those types of questions, or do they want to pretend that it's just inscrutable? And Frank Pascal argues that it's kind of a corporate trope, is to say that everything's proprietary or it's inscrutable and we just can't explain it, because they just don't want to explain it, either because it's proprietary and they are afraid they're giving up some sort of competitive advantage, or they don't like the answer. And so it doesn't behoove them to actually explain it. I think the answer from the business school was that they are hearing that it's an unadulterated good, that we automate everything, and that having a critical approach to AI or data analytics is not common in business schools. And that's what I find. I mean, I'm in a business school. We have a mandatory ethics class, but I don't think that that's kind of standard, is to teach data analytics and ethics of data analytics with data analytics. I mean, a lot of times they just learn the good about it and what's helpful. But what can you repeat the?
I guess my question.
Who should we do law or?
Given that what we seem to be running up against is a very strong cognitive frame that says these things are good, inevitably they will happen. The appropriate narrative is to say that they have these properties, even when computer scientists don't necessarily believe it. It feels like we just have an institutional framework that encourages thinking that looks increasingly divorced from people who sit in different fields.
Yeah.
Whether the only way to address that is through regulation, or can we do it through persuasion and slavery?
Yeah. Well, I think so. I do think so. It'd be great if professors, academics in business schools don't repeat it. So that would be like a first step. And so if we can get to the point where we don't take the idea of inscrutability as a given, because it's just a common trope to say it, or the idea that you have to trade off efficiency versus anything else, as if efficiency and accuracy were some sort of goal that we always have. And so even if you're profit focused, efficiency and accuracy is not a normal business goal to have. You're trying to figure out something that actually makes money. Efficiency and accuracy don't necessarily make money all the time if you're making bad decisions. So making bad decisions quickly is not that helpful. And so in fact, you could say that you get in trouble when you do that too quickly. And so I think if we get academics to start talking about it and querying it, so this gets to the other point that I just mentioned briefly, but there's some great work within computer science lamenting the amount of corporate influence on academics in computer science. And it's kind of an odd niche issue, but it influences a lot. And so what you have is that corporations are the major funders of PhD programs, of all their major conferences and their proceedings. They're the major funders. They fund more than the US government around AI and not ethics researchers, but AI and CS researchers. A lot of computer science engineers have side gigs at the big tech companies or even small tech companies. So they have like a foot in each. And so there's a couple of really interesting articles, one that likens it to big tobacco and how big tobacco actually captured academics to actually prove their point and do research on cancer, but not linking it to the actual harms of tobacco. But in this case, I would extend it to say, but the odd thing now is that some computer science engineering professors actually have side plots of tobacco, like they have their own tech companies that they're doing. And so it's a problem because then you have the corporate narrative actually influencing proceedings and kind of research agendas. And so to the point where conferences wanted to just include something where you had to talk about the negative impact of your research. So just in all of our research, you always have to talk about limitations or kind of like what are the downsides or what did you not account for or who could be harmed by these outcomes or something along those lines. And they fought that like crazy just to have a section in each article that said, what are the limitations of your work? Because the corporations that were funding the program only wanted to talk about the good side of AI. So it's kind of a inside baseball issue, but it really is interesting how it kind of sprinkles into the agenda. And so if we could get more independent funding of PhDs and computer scientists, I think that would be great. So that means more funding from large government organizations that would fund this type of research. Big universities should be funding their PhD programs independently and not have corporate funding. That would go a long way because then their research agenda is not being set by what corporations want to include. But that's it. We don't have that in business schools, but it comes up. So let me give one small example. I was asked to be on a paper on facial recognition. I said, look, you haven't even mentioned all the issues around facial recognition. Even NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States, they do an annual report on discrimination and facial recognition. And the answer was, we want to go for corporate funding. We don't want to include any of the negatives. And I was like, okay, I do not want to be on that paper. So it's insidious in the area. It's a problem.
Peter.
Yeah. I'm aware that we're running out of time. So I'll just ask one last question that I hope you'll be able to answer fairly quickly.
Okay.
One of our attendees is asking, so this goes back to the first few questions that we had in this Q&A session about these companies that don't really develop the algorithm, but then buy it and use it. And the question that our attendee has is about managers that make this decision to buy or use, potentially not having enough knowledge about AI to know what questions to ask or how to ask them. What do you think about this problem, and how can we make it a little bit easier for this type of actor to behave in a way that's responsible and that promotes a better use of AI?
Yeah, it's not a new problem. We used to have this for years when you'd buy like large enterprise resource planning tools, like so big and small software packages that companies would buy, and the clients themselves didn't know how to purchase them. And so they would hire I used to do this work. You would hire a consultant to come in and help you choose the best one and actually ask questions and query the company that was trying to sell to the client. This is different because everything's cheaper, so you can't afford to bring in a consultant and spend a couple $1 million on that. So, but we could do something like having auditing firms that actually give a stamp of approval on certain types of AI programs, so that then you know if you're an education company or like an education system and you're purchasing AI to surveil your students, that you know it has a certain stamp of approval because it's been audited in a certain way. That would require things like certain industries actually saying you can't purchase or you're going to be held responsible unless it has that stamp of approval. And that would outsource the auditing to somebody else versus the client that's actually purchasing it, almost like a good seal of approval or something along those lines. So there might have to be that type of work for everyone to feel comfortable buying something and knowing that they're not going to be, held liable literally for discriminatory decisions that they might make.
Do you think, just very quickly, do you think there's also a role for regulation there? Or
There could be, I think, like being able to, before you sell into, the way that it would start would be some sort of government, like agencies like law enforcement or public schools or something along those lines, where the government would say, look, you're not allowed to buy a program that deals with individuals or students unless it passes these type of criteria. That would be a law that would actually start it. In the United States, we do a lot of things through the government or the defense. So if you're a supplier to the government or defense industry, that's one mechanism to put a standard within the government, and then that filters into the private sector because everyone wants to sell into the government. So that's one mechanism to have a law to say you have to be audited in certain ways, or whatever you purchase needs to have this type of seal. Otherwise, you're going to be held responsible for whatever bad decisions that you're making.
Thank you. I'm really sorry. I apologize to everyone who asked really good questions and that we didn't really get time to ask Kirsten, but I promise that she'll receive all of them, so she can think about them afterwards, and they will not be lost. Let me just take the opportunity to thank Kirsten again. This was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for coming and for helping us to think through these very important problems. This has been absolutely wonderful. And finally, I just want to advertise our next retro seminar. It will be the last of this term, the last before Christmas. So it would be really lovely to see all of you there. It's going to take place in 2 weeks as usual, so the 1st of December at the same time. And our speaker is going to be Dennis G. Arnold from UNC Charlotte, who will be talking about care in management. It's going to be a fascinating talk as well, for sure. So please do register, and I hope to see many of you there. So thank you again for coming, and thank you, Kirsten. This was great.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.